Hey guys, Wes here. In this video, we're going to be looking at securing the backend of an application using Auth0. So I've been getting a ton of questions lately related to JWTs and Auth in general, and so I want to make a two-part video series that just goes in depth, looking at a practical example of Auth and protecting some backend endpoints. We'll look at user authentication, we'll look at how to wire all of this up together, and then in a follow-up video, we'll do a deeper dive into JWTs in general and explore some of the key concepts that you'll hear about in authentication and authorization. So things like ID tokens, access tokens, refresh tokens, what some of the algorithms and the protocols are. That will follow up in a second video. In this first video, I just wanted to take a really practical approach looking at how we can create a Vue.js app and interact with an Express backend and actually secure our backend using Auth0. It actually won't take us very long to set this project up, and I think it'll be a really good learning resource. If you enjoy deeper dives into things like web development, software engineering in general, machine learning, and DevOps, then be sure to subscribe for more videos like this in the future. With that, let's take a look at our application. Okay, so for the purposes of this demo, I've already pre-built some code and I've pushed it up to a public GitHub repo that you can find at github.com/productive-dev/auth0-demo, and you'll find that this repo contains two projects. It contains a demo.client project. This is our Vue.js application, and it also contains a demo.server project, which is just a bare bones Express application. It contains two routes, a public route and a route that requires some authorization, which we'll look at momentarily. So just to demonstrate how you can pull this project down from GitHub, I'm just going to clone it into a project directory. So here I'm just going to run git clone and then pull down that repo. And then I'm going to cd into that directory. And then as mentioned, we can find those two different projects here. So first of all, let's just go into the Vue.js application. And now we can run yarn install. And this is simply going to look in that package.json file and install all of the dependencies that are required for this project. Okay, so once that's complete, we can run yarn serve. This is going to start up our Vue application on port 8080. Now, note that we're not running that backend Express API yet, and so our front-end application won't actually be able to fetch the data that it needs, but nonetheless, it should be able to start, and we can actually take a look at localhost port 8080. And so you'll find we just have a bare bones application here. We have two pages in our app. We have a home and then we have a notes page, and you'll note that we're not actually getting any data back here. In fact, if we inspect and we take a look at the console here, we'll find that we are getting a network error because we're trying to make a request to an API which is not currently running. So we'll leave this open, and then in a new terminal window, or in my case, I'm using Tmux, so I'm just going to open up a new pane here. We're going to go into that demo server subdirectory, and here we're going to run npm install. And now we'll run npm run start, and this is going to start up our Express API, which you can see is listening on port 8000. So now let's head back to our browser, and if we just refresh the page, we can see that we're getting those responses back, or rather that single response back from the public route, and we are seeing some public notes here. So these are coming back, and then Vue is just rendering them into these bootstrap cards. And if we take a look at the network tab, we can see here that it's making a request on port 8000/API/public notes, and we're getting back this JSON object that we're then rendering into our front-end components here. Now if I select request private notes, you can see what's going to happen is that we get this unauthorized response back in the browser, which is manifesting as a toast here, saying that we cannot view private notes rather. And if we take a look at that HTTP request here, we can see that it's in fact telling us that we're unauthorized because we have a malformed JWT. So now let's select sign in, and you'll see we get taken over to Auth 0. We have this pop-up, and I'm going to simply log in. Once I've logged in, I'm going to be redirected back to the home page in our application. And now that I'm logged in, you can see that we have a message out to this part of the page that says we're logged in, and I'm displaying an ID token and an access token, and these are both actually JWTs. We'll talk in a little bit more detail about the difference between the ID token and the access token, but it's important to know that they are JWTs and that I'm pulling them actually from local storage. So if we head over on my machine here to the application tab, and then we just take a look in local storage, you can see that I have this ID token and this access token, and so our Vue application is actually pulling those from local storage, and then we can use the access token, for instance, to make an authorized request to our API. So what I'd like to do now is to demonstrate that this is a JWT and take a look at what's encoded in this JWT. So we have one on the left and one on the right, an ID token and an access token. Let's just take a look at what's in this access token. And for this, the easiest way is to just head over to jwt.io and paste this into the encoded text box here. You can see it says paste a token here. And keep in mind that this is all client-side, so we're not actually storing any secrets in this code. There's nothing essentially that we wouldn't necessarily want to make public in this code because everything is happening client-side here. So what is happening though is that this token has been signed by an authority, in this case Auth 0, and so that if it's tampered with, when this token is used to make some authorized request on our backend, if it's been tampered with, we should be able to know because we can verify its signature. And so we can see the three parts of our JWT here, and JWTs in general are very easy to parse because we can see that the three parts are separated, if you will, by a period. And so we have the header, the payload, and the signature. In the payload, we can see that this particular JWT is in fact a JWT, and that the signature or encryption algorithm here is RS-256. And then we can see the key ID here as well. The payload has some standard properties, including the issuer, which is Auth 0, of course, the subject, in other words, whom the token refers to, and in these Auth 0 tokens, they're prefixed with Auth 0 and a pipe. We can see the audience. We'll take a look at that momentarily, the issued at date and the expiry date, as well as the authorized party. And then the scope is a custom attribute here. This is an access token, and so we can actually use this when we send this token to the backend. We can inspect the scope to see if this particular user or machine that has sent this JWT with the request has access to only certain things that we want them to have access to, if you will. In other words, that we can use this to basically assign and control permissions. And then we have the signature here, and if we wanted to, we could paste the private key here just to verify the signature. Okay, so that's a quick look at the access token. If you were to look at the ID token, you'd also find that it's a JWT. It has a nonce in this case, in other words, the unique value associating the particular request with the token. We don't see the scope attribute here, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the ID token and the access token in a moment. Okay, so those are our JWTs. They're coming from local storage. And now that we're logged in, we head over to notes. Now if we request private notes, we'll actually be using that access token. And now we're actually authorized to make that request. And so our API will send back the results that we've actually requested. If we sign out, note that we can no longer see this information. And if we head back to our network tab and refresh here, and then request private notes. Again, now we're not authorized to view the private notes. If we sign in, we now have that access token, and we can head over to notes and request them, and we have them. In fact, if you head to your application tab and sign out, you can see that when we select sign out, our Vue application is actually just destroying those keys from local storage, which is why when we try to fetch them here, we run into this error in which we're handling by saying that we're unauthorized. We'll take a look at all of that in the code momentarily. Let's head over to Auth0 to look at how we set this up. I'm going to log into Auth0. And then what I've done here is I've created an API. So you'll go through and create an API. I've called this one PD Demo API. You're going to get an ID for the API, and you'll be able to provide a name and then an identifier here. And Auth0 will recommend using a URL, but this doesn't necessarily need to resolve to an actual URL. It's just an identifier. It's not something that it's actually going to hit. So I've used the URL here, but again, you don't necessarily need to. This is just going to be used as the audience parameter on authorization calls, which we'll take a look at in the code momentarily. There are some things we can do with the tokens that we're issuing. We can set their expiration. We can choose the signing algorithm. We'll be using RS-256 here, and some other things that we can control for the API, which we won't get into for the purposes of this demo. Now, if we take a look at the permissions tab here, this is a sort of optional thing, but I wanted to demonstrate it because it is pretty common. You'll most often hear this referred to as scopes. And when we looked at that JWT earlier, we saw that we had a custom property on it, full access. This is a scope, and so we can see that we can create scopes here just as key value pairs. And then we could use these on our backend in our Express API, for instance, to determine whether or not there were permissions for the particular requester. So we are simply creating one here called full access. But again, you could use scopes here to control or limit access. Now, if we head into applications, we'll run create application. And for the purposes of the demo, I've created a machine-to-machine application, and I've called this PD Demo API app. So what you'll get here is a page showing you the domain, which you should get when you sign up with Auth0. You'll get a client ID, a client secret. You can provide a description here. You can customize the login page with an application logo and that sort of thing. You can choose the endpoint authentication method. Post is typical here. And then we'll need to provide allowed callback URLs. In this case, we're just running our apps locally, so localhost 8080/callback will be used, and we'll look at how this maps to our front-end application momentarily. For allowed web origins and origins cores, we're going to just simply use localhost 8080. You can provide a comma-separated list here if you needed separate, or multiple, I should say, environments. So let's just say you had like dev.somesite and, or multiple different allowed web origins here if you were going to deploy this application, for instance. But since, again, we're running things locally here, we'll use localhost 8080. We'll set an ID token expiration here. This is just for that ID token. And for the purposes of this demo, I also have not set up a refresh token. So we can save changes here. You can also see there are some advanced settings here. Auth0 is really a full-featured platform. I'm not associated with them in any way, but I have found them to be a really useful platform. I should note that grant types here, we will be using an implicit flow, so we need to select that. Under advanced settings, grant types, and check implicit. You can see we have WS Federation and our certificates here, as well as a list of useful endpoints. Our JSON web key set endpoint will be important. This URL just points to our JSON web key set, or JWKS. This is a set of keys which contains the public keys used to verify any JWT that's issued by Auth0 in this case, or whatever the particular authorization server is. So those JWTs that are issued by Auth0 here are signed using RS-256. And RS-256 generates an asymmetric signature, which means that a private key must be used to sign the JWT and a different public key must be used to verify the signature. So this JSON web key set is just a JSON object that's available at this URL, and it in particular must contain this keys property here. And this keys is just an array of those JWKs. So you'll have one or more JWK at your URL when you sign in and take a look at this endpoint. And this will actually be used by our API. And so we'll take a look at that momentarily. Okay, so let's take a brief look at the code and see how all of this gets wired up to allow us to make authorized calls once we've authenticated as a user. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio Code, and we have our two projects, our client and our server. And in this particular demo, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of Vue.js in particular, but I just want to note that we have a very simple Vue.js project that was created using the Vue CLI and then modified in order to support this particular demo. So we have an app.vue, and it contains this custom navbar component as well as the router view. So we have those two different pages in our application, the home page and then the notes page. So if we take a look back here in our client, we've got the home page, which is just at the root URL, and then /notes takes us here. Okay, so let's take a look at this navbar, because this is where things really start to get interesting. So within components, we've got this navbar component. Anything that you see in this component or throughout this project which is prefixed with B/ here, this is provided by Bootstrap Vue, and so these are pre-built components that are provided for us by that library, which simply wrap some Bootstrap styled components that we can reuse. And so I've got a navbar, and then the two most important parts of this navbar are the sign in and the sign out buttons. We're only showing the sign in button if we're not logged in, of course, and when we are logged in, we're only showing the sign out button. We're only showing the sign in button when we're not logged in, and we're only showing the sign out button when we are logged in. And when we click on sign in, we're handling that with the handle login method, and likewise handle logout when we need to sign out. So let's take a look at that. These are simple methods which are just wrapping a couple of helper methods that we have in an auth service. In the auth service, we also have the ability to check whether or not we are logged in. So these are essentially proxy methods for that very simple auth service that we'll take a look at now. So let's head into utils and then auth service, and this is really where all the significant logic happens on the front end. Now, for the purposes of this demo, I have simply defined these constants here directly as strings that are hard-coded, but these you would certainly want to put into a config file that you could swap out depending on the environment that you're deploying to. For the purposes of this simple demo, just so we can read through it rather quickly, I have defined them as constants here. But you'll find many of these values over at the Auth0 platform after you have set up your API and your client application. So for instance, we need to pull our client ID from Auth0 and our client domain. The redirect we'll look at momentarily. We're going to redirect to this application /callback, and then the scope is full access, which we looked at previously, and the audience, again, we looked at previously as this PD demo API. So pull these values from Auth0 directly. I'll show you, for example, where some of them are. So client ID, we take a look back here, we can simply see that client ID here. Likewise, our domain is available here. If we take a look at our API, we can find our API ID here as well as that audience or identifier value. Okay, so this is really fairly simple to set up because, again, we are, in this case, inside of our service, just wrapping some functionality provided by the Auth0 library. And so we create this new instance, this WebAuth instance, that we pass our client ID and domain, and Auth0 really handles most of it from there. So for instance, when we want to log in, we simply call auth.authorize, pass in this response type string with our redirect URI, our audience, and our scope. Our logout method just simply invokes this clear ID token and clear access token. If we take a look at those, all these are really doing is simply removing from local storage that ID token and the access token, and then simply rerouting us to the root URL of our application. To get our access token, it's really just calling get item on local storage for those two tokens. And then when we want to set those access tokens, we'll be doing this in that callback URL route. And so we'll take a look at the component that takes care of this for us. But here we are simply calling get parameter by name, and we're going to get that directly from the URL. And here's a helper function. I pulled this directly from some documentation on Auth0. And so Auth0 is going to come back with these values, and then we can simply push them into local storage at whatever key we'd like to refer to them by, in this case, our access token key and our ID token key. We also have a little helper here to determine whether we're logged in. So we just get that ID token, and then we're simply returning true or false based on asserting the fact that it exists and that it's not expired. And we want to check that it's not expired. We can simply call get token expiration date, where we just decode the encoded token and essentially check whether or not it's been expired, and then just make sure that we return true or false based on whether or not that expiration date is in the past. Okay, so a very simple auth service. Now I mentioned we'd talk about this callback component, and this is invoked at the callback route. So very briefly, let's take a look at our routes, and there are only three of them. We have a home route, a notes route, and then the callback route. The callback route just maps directly to our callback component. So this callback component that we were just looking at, this is where I mentioned we would be setting the access token and the ID token, and really this is just then sending us back to that home page. And so basically the flow, if you think about it here, is that when we click sign in, we authenticate with Auth0. Auth0 reads our username and password in this case and says, okay, this person is authenticated, and if they are, then they are going to route us back to the appropriate callback route, which in our case is mapped to this callback component in Vue. It's going to send us back that ID token and the access token in the URL, and we're going to parse those using our service, using set access token and set ID token, and push those into local storage so that we can then use them to make authorized requests. So we've authenticated as users. Our auth provider here has confirmed that we are who we say we are when we authenticate, and then we can actually make authorized requests to our own API based on the fact that we have these tokens now in local storage that we can use that have been signed by Auth0. Okay, so how does that happen? Well, let's look in nodes.vue, and we can see another fairly simple Vue component here. Again, I don't want to get into the details of Vue too much in this particular video, but we have a list of cards that we want to loop through, in this case public cards, or public notes in this case. They're getting pushed into Bootstrap cards, and we're just going to display that note value on each of them that come back. And then we have a button to get private notes, and when we click it, we're going to invoke the get private notes method. And just below that, we loop over for note in private notes and display those to the page in much the same way that we did with our public notes. But the difference is in the details of each of the methods. So in the methods for this component, getting public notes is just calling get public notes from a card service that we'll look at briefly. And then it's going to assign the value that it gets back here to the public notes value for this component. Now get private notes is a little bit different, but the functionality is essentially analogous. We'll call get private notes, and then we assign them to those private notes. But in the event that there's some failure, we're going to create this toast, which is just using Bootstrap toast, and it's just going to display that unauthorized message for us. And then finally, it's going to set isLoading to false. So we set isLoading to true, which is just a minor sort of UI detail here where we have a Bootstrap spinner that's only going to be displayed on our page when we're loading. Okay, so essentially the logic is when we call get private notes, show the loader get private notes, which makes a call to our note service that we'll look at momentarily. And if there's some error in this case, we create this toast telling us that we're unauthorized. Otherwise, if all is good, then we just show those private notes, and then no matter what, we simply hide that is loading loader once the request is complete. So let's take a look at what's happening now in this notes service. So this is sort of the remaining piece of logic for the front end. And again, we should parameterize this, but for the purposes of the demo, I have a hard-coded constant base URL here. This is our API endpoint or API URL, base URL. And we simply have two functions here, a get public notes function and a get private notes function. Get public notes is pointing to the route /API /public notes. We're using Axios to simply get those or make that HTTP request and then return that data. And then get private notes, however, is actually making a request to /API /private notes on our API. And in this case, it's sending along some authorization headers. And in this case, we need the authorization header prefix bearer. And then we call get access token, which we looked at previously, which is simply going to return the access token from local storage. So in the event that we've logged out and we've destroyed that value in local storage, then this will be a malformed authorization header because it will just be bearer and then space essentially. And so any request with that header to an authorized route will of course fail, which is why it fails when we're logged out. However, when we log in, we hit our callback route, which invokes our callback component, which sets our access token to local storage or stores it in local storage. And then we're able to fetch it from local storage when we invoke get private notes. And so now we have an appropriately formatted authorization header with bearer followed by that access token JWT here. And when we make this HTTP request now, as we'll look at momentarily, our backend is able to actually use that authorization header to say, hey, this looks like a signed JWT. Therefore, I will authorize the requester to make this particular request and respond with the appropriate data. Okay, so with that in mind, it would be good to take a look at the backend, which is really just like the simplest Express API with some particular magic provided by, with some particular functionality provided by the Express JWT library and the JWKS RSA library, which is actually provided by Auth0. So what's important to note here is that we've got two endpoints, again, public notes and private notes as we saw invoked from the front end. The only difference is that private notes contains this auth check middleware. And if we take a look at what this is, we're essentially invoking this helper method, this Express JWT secret, to create this secret parameter. And so this is what's allowing us to use that RS-256 algorithm. We took a look at that JSON web key set previously, which we mentioned was that set of keys that contains the public keys used to verify any JWT issued by Auth0 in this case, and signed using RS-256. So using this Express JWT secret, we can generate a secret provider that will provide the right signing key to Express JWT based on the key ID in the JWT header. So long story short, this provides us with some really nice utility here to first of all be able to cache it. We can rate limit it and assign a request per minute to that particular JWKS. And we need to provide the URI here, which we pulled from Auth0. Again, you can find this if we head back to our application actually, and then advanced settings and then endpoints here. We can find that JSON web key set URL here. Otherwise, it's always going to be whatever your Auth0 domain is, /.wellknown/jwks.json. The audience that we need to provide here, again, is provided to us on our APIs page. And then if you go into your API, this is also what's referred to as your API identifier. And then the issuer is just your Auth0 domain. And as mentioned, we're using RS-256 here. So this Express JWT secret is going to take the token that we're sending, essentially decode it and look for that key ID or KID. And we saw that previously in JWT.io it's going to find the right signing key for it, which is provided by our JWTs URI or JSON web key set. And in that way, it's going to be able to validate whether or not it is an appropriately signed, valid JWT that it can use to make authorized requests. And we can just include that as Express middleware here on this route. And then assuming that it's valid, we should be authorized to make a request at this route. And so as we can see from the demo, once we are signed in, we have an access token in local storage that we can see here. And again, if you're interested in inspecting it, just copy and paste this over into jwt.io and take a look at what's actually encoded in the token. But we're actually using this now in Express when we make this particular request to that private notes route or endpoint. And in fact, if we want to inspect it even further, if we head over to the network tab and look at this request that we just made to private notes and take a look at those headers, note that we have that authorization header on the request now, prefixed with bearer, and then this will actually match our access token. So if we head home, and here I'm going to select preserve log, head back to notes, request private notes. Let's pull this up again and then head back home and take a look at private notes. In our request headers here, we have this bearer and then this token. You can actually see that this is in fact using that access token. So we're just pulling that from local storage to make this HTTP request. And you can see we're getting a 200 response back from our server. So it's essentially taking this middleware is essentially taking this key, it's taking a look at the key ID, and then it's using our JSON web key set here to match that up with the key ID here. Again, this is all public. And if first of all, if a key ID doesn't match any of the keys in our JSON web key set here, an error will be thrown. But if we do have a match here, then it's going to pass the signing key to Express.jwt, and Express.jwt here will validate the signature of the token, the expiration, the audience, etc. And so in this way, we've demonstrated how we can wire up a very simple Vue.js application in which we make a request to a publicly available route, as well as a route that requires authorization after being authenticated with an auth server, in this case auth0, and making those calls to an Express web API. All right, so that's it. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you guys have any questions whatsoever, then be sure to leave them in the comments below, and stay tuned for the follow-up video where we'll do a deeper dive on JWTs and topics in authentication, authorization in general. Thanks for watching.